12,900 years ago, the flood came, but not the way you were told. The Ice Age was ending. Rivers ran freely. Human communities thrived along coastlines that no longer exist. And then, without warning, the sky tore open. A brilliant object shattered into flaming fragments. Forests ignited across continents. Mammoths stampeded through walls of smoke. And as the fires raged, glaciers cracked, unleashing torrents of meltwater that swallowed valleys, drowned entire homelands, and erased landscapes from existence. Within a single century, sea levels surged more than 7 meters. The world plunged back into ice, and the people who witnessed it had no words for climate change, only God's wrath and the end of all things. This was not myth. This was the Younger Dryas, and it may be the real great flood behind every deluge story ever told. We're taught that civilization begins with Mesopotamia, that the first cities rose 5,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, and before that, humanity wandered in darkness. But what if that timeline is incomplete? What if a catastrophic flood, not in the time of Noah or Gilgamesh, but thousands of years earlier, washed away an entire chapter of human history? What if the ancestors of every flood myth lived through a real planetary drowning, and their memories survived only as broken stories carved into stone, whispered through generations, and buried beneath rising seas? Join me now as we follow the trail of evidence left behind by the Younger Dryas cataclysm. We will walk through fields of charred earth rich with cosmic signatures. We will dive beneath modern oceans to drowned continents. We will trace flood legends across every inhabited landmass. And we will stand before the world's oldest monument, built perhaps by survivors determined never to forget. Together we will ask the question that changes everything. What if the Younger Dryas was the real Great Flood? Before we journey back 12,000 years, if you're drawn to these forgotten catastrophes, do well to subscribe and leave a like on the video, and tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight. Now, let the present fade. Let us return to the flood. The wind is cold and still, as if the earth itself remembers. Imagine standing at the edge of the last ice age some 12,900 years ago, on a coastline that will soon cease to exist. To the north, glaciers gleam under pale sunlight, their edges softening as the world warms. To the south, forests stretch endlessly, alive with the sounds of creatures we will never see again. Fire and water, two forces that should oppose each other, are about to come together in a moment that rewrites the story of our species. The comet blazes across the sky, breaking into glowing shards. The earth shudders beneath flame and frost. This is the threshold of the Younger Dryas, an M.E. that would slam the door on 10,000 years of warming and hurl humanity back into chaos. We think of time as something stable, predictable. But here it breaks apart. Only centuries before, the great ice sheets gripping North America and Europe had been retreating. Sea levels were rising gradually. Lakes had formed behind walls of ice, and humanity scattered bands of coastal dwellers and inland hunters tasted the promise of a gentler world. Then that promise was torn away in what must have felt like the blink of an eye. Ice returned. Forests burned and died. Temperatures dropped with terrifying speed. The trail is written in the ice cores of Greenland, drilled 3 kilometers deep. Each layer is a frozen snapshot of ancient air. Oxygen isotopes reveal a drop of up to 10 degrees centigrade in mere decades. One moment the earth was warming, glaciers retreating, life spreading. The next a pulled back as though struck by an invisible fist. The Younger Dryas was not a minor climate change. It was a break in the rhythm of the planet itself. But what caused it? Some say it was Lake of Gases, a vast reservoir of glacial meltwater, larger than all the Great Lakes combined, bursting through its icy dam and pouring into the North Atlantic. A flood so immense it choked the ocean's great conveyor belt, the Atlantic Meridian, overturning circulation, shutting down the current that carried warmth northward. Without it, Europe froze. North America was buried beneath tundra. Spring never came. Others point to the heavens. They argue that a comet, or a swarm of comets, shattered in Earth's atmosphere, raining superheated fragments that ignited wildfires on a continental scale. Fires were followed by floods. Coal followed fire. And if any early civilizations had existed beyond scattered hunter-gatherer camps, they were erased. Imagine the people who lived through this sudden reversal of fate. Hunters tracking reindeer across Doggerland, the fertile plains connecting Britain to Europe, suddenly found their grasslands swallowed by ice and rising seas. In the Levant, Natufian communities that had just begun harvesting wild grains watched their settlements collapse under relentless drought. In the Americas, Paleo-Indian mammoth hunters saw their prey vanish into walls of flame and smoke. Did they understand what had struck them? Or did they, like us, weave stories to explain the unexplainable tales of angry gods, falling stars, and floods that drowned the world? The Younger Dryas is both an ending and a beginning. The end of a warming age, the collapse of ecosystems, the possible destruction of cultures we have forgotten, but also perhaps the beginning of what we call history. The crucible that forced humanity to adapt, invent, and rebuild from ashes. 2. Some, the Younger Dryas is an obscure climate event buried in deep time. 2. Others, it is the Great Reset, the flood that washed away an earlier chapter of our species and left us stranded on the shore of a new world. Yet the Earth does not leave its secrets neatly labeled. The truth of this cataclysm is scattered across frozen records, in the bones of vanished beasts, in myths that echo across continents, and in monuments that may have been raised by those who survived. To understand whether the Younger Dryas was the true Great Flood, we must follow these fragments from geology to legend, from fire-blackened soils to carved megaliths, from drowned coastlines to the DNA of ghost populations erased from history. As twilight falls across the frozen plain, the fires in the sky fade. Ice advances, silently, swallowing rivers and valleys. The world waits, humanity waits, and the question lingers in the cold air. When the flood came, what did it erase and what did it preserve? Hidden beneath layers of water and myth. Picture yourself kneeling beside a dry arroyo in the American Southwest. The soil crumbles under your fingers, tan-ochre, unremarkable. And then, something changes. A thin dark band appears, no thicker than your palm. Within it, flecks of charcoal, grains of soot, and something far stranger. Iridium, platinum, macroscopic diamonds formed only under pressures no earthly fire can produce. Archaeologists call these layers black mats. And they are found across North America, Europe, the Middle East, and South Africa, always at the same moment in time, always marking the Younger Dryas boundary, always lying over the bones of creatures that would never be seen again. To some, they are simply the remnants of ancient wetlands. But to others, they are the ash blankets of a global inferno. The charred signature of fire from the sky. The black mats are thin. You could miss them if you weren't looking at dark stripe pressed between layers of lighter sediment like 12,900 years ago, the flood came, but not the way you were told. The Ice Age was ending. Rivers ran freely. Human communities thrived along coastlines that no longer exist. And then, without warning, the sky tore open. A brilliant object shattered into flaming fragments. Forests ignited across continents. Mammoths stampeded through walls of smoke. And as the fires raged, glaciers cracked, unleashing torrents of meltwater that swallowed valleys, drowned entire homelands, and erased landscapes from existence. Within a single century, sea levels surged more than 7 meters. The world plunged back into ice, and the people who witnessed it had no words for climate change, only God's wrath and the end of all things. This was not myth. This was the Younger Dryas, and it may be the real great flood behind every deluge story ever told. We're taught that civilization begins with Mesopotamia, that the first cities rose 5,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, and before that, humanity wandered in darkness. But what if that timeline is incomplete? What if a catastrophic flood, not in the time of Noah or Gilgamesh, but thousands of years earlier, washed away an entire chapter of human history? What if the ancestors of every flood myth lived through a real planetary drowning, and their memories survived only as broken stories carved into stone, whispered through generations, and buried beneath rising seas? Join me now as we follow the trail of evidence left behind by the Younger Dryas cataclysm. We will walk through fields of charred earth rich with cosmic signatures. We will dive beneath modern oceans to drowned continents. We will trace flood legends across every inhabited landmass. And we will stand before the world's oldest monument, built perhaps by survivors determined never to forget. Together we will ask the question that changes everything. What if the Younger Dryas was the real Great Flood? Before we journey back 12,000 years, if you're drawn to these forgotten catastrophes, do well to subscribe and leave a like on the video, and tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight. Now, let the present fade. Let us return to the flood. The wind is cold and still, as if the earth itself remembers. Imagine standing at the edge of the last ice age some 12,900 years ago, on a coastline that will soon cease to exist. To the north, glaciers gleam under pale sunlight, their edges softening as the world warms. To the south, forests stretch endlessly, alive with the sounds of creatures we will never see again. Fire and water, two forces that should oppose each other, are about to come together in a moment that rewrites the story of our species. The comet blazes across the sky, breaking into glowing shards. The earth shudders beneath flame and frost. This is the threshold of the Younger Dryas, an M.E. that would slam the door on 10,000 years of warming and hurl humanity back into chaos. We think of time as something stable, predictable. But here it breaks apart. Only centuries before, the great ice sheets gripping North America and Europe had been retreating. Sea levels were rising gradually. Lakes had formed behind walls of ice, and humanity scattered bands of coastal dwellers and inland hunters tasted the promise of a gentler world. Then that promise was torn away in what must have felt like the blink of an eye. Ice returned. Forests burned and died. Temperatures dropped with terrifying speed. The trail is written in the ice cores of Greenland, drilled 3 kilometers deep. Each layer is a frozen snapshot of ancient air. Oxygen isotopes reveal a drop of up to 10 degrees centigrade in mere decades. One moment the earth was warming, glaciers retreating, life spreading. The next it pulled back as though struck by an invisible fist. The Younger Dryas was not a minor climate change. It was a break in the rhythm of the planet itself. But what caused it? Some say it was lake of gases, a vast reservoir of glacial meltwater, larger than all the Great Lakes combined, bursting through its icy dam and pouring into the North Atlantic. A flood so immense it choked the ocean's great conveyor belt, the Atlantic Meridian, overturning circulation, shutting down the current that carried warmth northward. Without it, Europe froze. North America was buried beneath tundra. Spring never came. Others point to the heavens. They argue that a comet, or a swarm of comets, shattered in Earth's atmosphere, raining superheated fragments that ignited wildfires on a continental scale. Fires were followed by floods. Coal followed fire. And if any early civilizations had existed beyond scattered hunter-gatherer camps, they were erased. Imagine the people who lived through this sudden reversal of fate. Hunters tracking reindeer across Doggerland, the fertile plains connecting Britain to Europe, suddenly found their grasslands swallowed by ice and rising seas. In the Levant, Natufian communities that had just begun harvesting wild grains watched their settlements collapse under relentless drought. In the Americas, Paleo-Indian mammoth hunters saw their prey vanish into walls of flame and smoke. Did they understand what had struck them? Or did they, like us, weave stories to explain the unexplainable tales of angry gods, falling stars, and floods that drowned the world? The Younger Dryas is both an ending and a beginning. The end of a warming age, the collapse of ecosystems, the possible destruction of cultures we have forgotten, but also perhaps the beginning of what we call history. The crucible that forced humanity to adapt, invent, and rebuild from ashes. To some, the Younger Dryas is an obscure climate event buried in deep time. To others, it is the Great Reset, the flood that washed away an earlier chapter of our species and left us stranded on the shore of a new world. Yet the Earth does not leave its secrets neatly labeled. The truth of this cataclysm is scattered across frozen records, in the bones of vanished beasts, in myths that echo across continents, and in monuments that may have been raised by those who survived. To understand whether the Younger Dryas was the true Great Flood, we must follow these fragments from geology to legend, from fire-blackened soils to carved megaliths, from drowned coastlines to the DNA of ghost populations erased from history. As twilight falls across the frozen plain, the fires in the sky fade. Ice advances silently, swallowing rivers and valleys. The world waits. Humanity waits. And the question lingers in the cold air. When the flood came, what did it erase and what did it preserve? Hidden beneath layers of water and myth. Picture yourself kneeling beside a dry arroyo in the American Southwest. The soil crumbles under your fingers, tan ochre, unremarkable. And then something changes. A thin dark band appears, no thicker than your palm. Within it, flecks of charcoal, grains of soot, and something far stranger. Iridium, platinum, macroscopic diamonds formed only under pressures no earthly fire can produce. Archaeologists call these layers black mats. And they are found across North America, Europe, the Middle East, and South Africa, always at the same moment in time, always marking the Younger Dryas boundary, always lying over the bones of creatures that would never be seen again. To some, they are simply the remnants of ancient wetlands. But to others, they are the ash blankets of a global inferno. The charred signature of fire from the sky. The black mats are thin. You could miss them if you weren't looking a dark stripe pressed between layers of lighter sediment like a bookmark placed in the pages of deep time. But their thinness hides their importance. At Murray Springs in Arizona, this charred layer sits directly above the remains of mammoths and Columbian horses. Their bones, mingled with the elegant fluted projectile points of the Clovis people, the earliest widespread culture in North America. Below the black mat, life teemed. Above it, silence. The megafauna vanished. The Clovis culture disappeared. And in their place is a scorched boundary that stretches continent to continent. At Blackwater Draw in New Mexico, the same pattern repeats. Mammoth bones beneath a dark layer rich with charcoal. At Topper in South Carolina, soot and ash marking a sudden end. And it's not just North America. In Belgium, black mats appear at Younger Dryas sites, packed with microscopic particles that suggest intense heat. In Syria, at the ancient village of Abu Hurair, archaeologists uncovered something even more unsettling. Grains of wild barley and rye fused into glass-like fragments, as though they had been exposed to temperatures exceeding 2,200 degrees centigrade, hotter than any natural fire, hotter than any pottery kiln of the year. In South Africa, sediment layers record continent-wide wildfires happening in perfect synchrony with the start of the Younger Dryas. This is not a regional event. This is a planetary signature. But what exactly are the black mats? To some researchers, the answer is simple: wetlands. As the climate shifted and the Younger Dryas cold snap took hold, landscapes that had been dry became waterlogged. Swamps formed. Organic material built up in still ponds, breaking down into dark carbon-rich layers. In this view, the black mats are simply the natural result of environmental change. Unremarkable, if sadly timed. But others see something far more threatening. They point to what the black mats are made of. Yes, there is charcoal evidence of burning. But there is also iridium, a rare element more common in asteroids than in Earth's crust. There are platinum spikes, strange highs that hint at an extraterrestrial source. And most of all, there are nanodiamonds. Microscopic crystals that form only under extreme pressures and temperatures, the kind delivered by cosmic impacts or airbursts. These are not the clues of a quiet wetland. These are the fingerprints of catastrophe. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis says that around 12,900 years ago, a Brockenip comet, or maybe a swarm of smaller objects, entered Earth's atmosphere and exploded. Not one crash, but many airbursts, detonating across the northern hemisphere with the force of nuclear weapons. The evidence is scattered, but it adds up. At Whidbey Island in Washington state, researchers uncovered the black mat studded with magnetic spherules, tiny droplets of melted rock that cooled while falling through the air. These spherules contain metals in ratios that do not match normal volcanic activity on Earth. Instead, they look like debris from something that burned, as if fell from space. In Greenland, ice cores reveal a sharp platinum spike at exactly the Younger Dryas boundary. Platinum, like iridium, is rare on Earth's surface, but common in comets and asteroids. Its sudden appearance in the ice suggests an extraterrestrial visitor left its signature across the polar regions. And then there's Abu Hurair. This ancient settlement in northern Syria was lived in continuously for thousands of years until the Younger Dryas. Excavations revealed something extraordinary: meltwater. Tiny mineral fragments that had been heated so intensely they turned to liquid and then hardened again. Analysis showed that temperatures reached 2,200 degrees centigrade, or higher, far beyond anything a forest fire or human activity could produce. The researchers concluded that the glass could only have formed from an airburst, a cosmic object exploding in the atmosphere above the village, creating a shock wave of superheated air that scraped the landscape and melted the soil itself. Imagine standing in that village. You hear a roar like the world ripping apart. The sky ignites. A wall of heat crashes down, burning everything in its path. Those who survived the first blast would have stumbled through a burning wasteland under a sky dark with soot. And this may have happened not just in Syria, but across the northern hemisphere in a chain of synchronized detonations that set the world on fire. The fire came first. That's the twist. We think of the Younger Dryas as a freeze, a sudden return to ice, and it was. But before the cold, there was heat. Before the flood, there was flame. And here is where geology and mythology meet. Across the world, separated by oceans and thousands of years, cultures tell amazingly similar stories. They do not begin with water. They begin with fire. From the sky. The Hopi speak of the destruction of the third world when the sky rained fire and the earth was consumed by flames before the waters came. In Norse mythology, Ragnarok begins not with ice but with Surtur's flames, a conflagration that comes before the great flood and the remaking of the world. The Aztecs described the end of the fourth sun when fire rained from the heavens and the world burned before being drowned. In Aboriginal Australian traditions, stories speak of falling stars that brought fire, followed by rising seas that swallowed the coastal lands. Even in Mesopotamia, the oldest written flood story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, contains a curious detail, often overlooked. Before the flood, there is a description of a storm so fierce it turned daylight into darkness, and brought fire that scorched the land. For generations, these stories were dismissed as just mythology, allegory, moral tales, the early imagination trying to explain natural disasters. But what if they were memory? What if a reason flood myths around the world described fire before water is because that is exactly what happened? A cosmic impact or airburst triggered massive wildfires. Smoke and soot darkened the skies. The sudden heating destabilized glaciers. And in the aftermath, as the soot settled and the sun dimmed, the world plunged into cold, triggering the collapse of ice sheets and the catastrophic meltwater floods that followed. Fire, then flood, exactly as the myths describe. The black mats are not harmless geological oddities. They are a message written in ash, kept across continents, marking the moment when the planet's rhythm broke. They tell us that 12,900 years ago, something entered Earth's atmosphere. Whether it was one comet that shattered into fragments or a meteor stream Earth drifted through, the result was the same: a cascade of airbursts that ignited forests, vaporized organic matter, and stamped the soil with the chemical fingerprints of an extraterrestrial visitor. And in the wake of that fire, the ice returned. The seas rose, and the world humanity had known was erased. The question now is not whether the Younger Dryas was catastrophic. It clearly was. The question is who witnessed it, and what did they lose? To answer that, we must turn to the creatures that vanished, the ecosystems that collapsed, and the peoples whose names we will never know. Erased not by time, but by fire and flood. Before the fire and flood, the Earth was a world of giants. Imagine walking through North America 13,000 years ago when the ice sheets were still retreating, but had not yet unleashed their final deluge. The landscape would be unrecognizable not because of geography, but because of the creatures moving through it. Mammoths grazed in vast herds across grasslands that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, their curved tusks sweeping through prairie grass taller than a human. Mastodons browsed in spruce forests, stripping barkwood, trunks powerful enough to topple trees. Giant ground sloths, some weighing 4 tons, reared up on hind legs to reach high branches, their claws as long as kitchen knives. In the shadows, proud predators unlike any alive today, saber-toothed cats with canines the length of daggers hunted in packs. Dire wolves, larger and sturdier than modern wolves, followed the herds. Short-faced bears stood 12 feet tall on their hind legs, fast enough to run down horses, powerful enough to dominate any kill. And among them, dwarfed but undeterred, walked humans. These were the Clovis people and their contemporaries, Paleo-Indian cultures that had adapted to life alongside megafauna. They hunted mammoths with atlatls and razor-sharp stone points. They tracked giant bison across open plains. They understood the rhythms of migration, the patterns of the herds, the territories of the great predators. For thousands of years, this balance held. And then, at the Younger Dryas boundary, it broke. The collapse was not gradual. It was sudden, synchronized, and devastating. Within a few centuries of blink in geological time, 35 genera of North American megafauna vanished. Mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, short-faced bears, giant beavers, camels, horses, all gone. In South America, the toll was even higher. 50 genera disappeared, including giant armadillos, saber-toothed marsupials, and car-sized glyptodons. Europe and Northern Asia lost woolly rhinoceroses, cave bears, and Irish elk. Australia had already seen its megafauna collapse earlier, but the Younger Dryas dealt a final blow to isolated populations. The evidence is written in the same layers that hold the black mats. Below the boundary, bones are abundant mammoth skeletons, bison skulls, the remains of ecosystems bursting with life. Above the boundary, they vanish. The extinction is so sharp, so complete, that it points not to a slow decline, but to catastrophe. What could cause such a mass die-off? Some argue climate alone was enough. The Younger Dryas cold snap disrupted habitats, turned grasslands into tundra, and starved herbivores that depended on certain plants. But climate changes had happened many times before during the Ice Age, and the megafauna had survived them all. Why did this shift prove deadly? Others point to human overhunting, the overkill idea. As human populations grew and hunting methods improved, megafauna were driven to extinction. But this does not explain the synchronicity. Why did species across multiple continents, many with no contact with humans, vanish at the same time? The strongest explanation may be the collision of all 3 forces: cosmic fire, climate, chaos, and human pressure. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests that airbursts ignited wildfires that destroyed habitats on a continental scale. Ash and soot choked the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and killing vegetation. Herbivores starved. Predators followed, and human hunting, which might have been sustainable before, became the final blow to species already on the edge. The megafauna did not simply go extinct. They were raised, and with them went the cultures that depended on them. The Clovis people are perhaps the most famous casualty. For over 1,000 years, Clovis culture had spread across North America, recognizable by their distinctive fluted spear points, beautifully made blades designed to bring down mammoths and giant bison. Clovis sites stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from Canada to Central America, evidence of a widespread, successful adaptation to Ice Age megafauna hunting. Then, at the Younger Dryas boundary, Clovis points vanish from the archaeological record. Not gradually, not through a slow change into other tool types. They simply stop appearing. Sites that had been lived in for generations show sudden abandonment. The people did not vanish. They were ancestors to later Paleo-Indian groups, but their way of life, their technology, their culture collapsed so completely that archaeologists mark it as a clear break in human history. What happened to them? The most likely answer is ecological catastrophe. When the megafauna died, the Clovis lost their main food source. Mammoth hunting was not just about calories. It was about social structure, seasonal migration patterns, trade networks, and cultural identity. When the mammoths vanished, entire lifestyles vanished with them. Imagine being a Clovis hunter. Your grandfather hunted mammoths. Your father hunted mammoths. You were raised tracking their migrations, reading their behavior, crafting points for their thick hides, and then, within your lifetime, they are gone. The herds do not return. The landscapes burn and freeze. The old knowledge becomes useless. You adapt or you die. And many did not adapt. The collapse was not limited to the Americas. In the Levant, the region including modern Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, the Natufian culture faced its own crisis. The Natufians were among the world's first settled peoples, hunter-gatherers who had begun living in permanent villages and harvesting wild grains. They were on the edge of agriculture, experimenting with cultivation, building stone structures, burying their dead with ceremony. Then the Younger Dryas struck. Pollen records showed that the oak and pistachio forests the Natufians depended on withered under cold, dry conditions. Wild grain harvests failed. Natufian settlements, once thriving villages, were abandoned or shrank dramatically. Some archaeologists believe the Younger Dryas drought forced the Natufians to innovate, ultimately giving rise to true agriculture out of desperation. But others never recovered. Entire communities scattered, their knowledge scattered, their way of life interrupted. And in Doggerland, the vast landmass that once connected Britain to continental Europe, human populations faced a double destruction. First came the cold, which turned rich hunting grounds back into frozen tundra. Then came the water. As glaciers collapsed and meltwater poured into the North Atlantic, sea levels rose rapidly. Doggerland, already lowing, began to flood. Rivers became estuaries. Valleys became bays. And over the course of centuries, the entire region, along with its forests, its animals, and its human inhabitants, was swallowed by what is now the North Sea. Doggerland was not a minor place. Archaeological evidence suggests it was one of the richest ecosystems in prehistoric Europe, the crossroads where human populations from the north and south met, traded, and thrived. And it's gone. Every settlement, every hunting camp, every trace of the people who lived there now lies beneath 50 meters of cold, dark water. Their names are lost. Their stories are lost. Only the myth remains. And myth remembers giants. The Aztecs spoke of the end of the fourth sun when the world was inhabited by giants who were destroyed by fire and flood, making way for a new creation. The Greeks told of the Titanomachy, a war in which the old gods, the Titans, beings of immense size and power, were overthrown and cast into darkness. In Norse mythology, the giants are swept away during Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, when fire consumes the world and floods drown the land. Were these myths about gods and monsters? Or were they cultural memories of a time when giants truly walked the earth, mammoths and mastodons and towering bears, only to vanish in fire and flood? Ancient peoples lived alongside megafauna long enough to know them deeply. They painted them on cave walls. They carved them into bone and antler. They built their entire lives around these creatures. And then, within living memory, perhaps within a single generation, those creatures disappeared. To the survivors, it must have seemed as if the giants themselves had been punished, struck down by forces beyond understanding. And so the stories took shape: tales of worlds destroyed, of giants erased, of fire and flood remaking the earth. These are not allegories. They are echoes of extinction. The Younger Dryas did not just reset the climate, it reset life itself. The megafauna that had ruled the planet for millions of years were gone. The ecosystems built around them collapsed. The human cultures that depended on them were forced to adapt, migrate, or disappear. And in the silence that followed, humanity began not from strength, but from survival. But if the fire and the extinctions were only the beginning, what came next was even more catastrophic. Because as the world began to warm again, as the Younger Dryas cold finally loosened its grip, the ice sheaths that had survived for millennia began to collapse. And when they did, the real flood began. The ice had held for thousands of years walls of frozen water, kilometers thick, covering entire continents. But ice is not unbreakable. And when it breaks, it does not break quietly. Around 11,600 years ago, as the Younger Dryas cold snap finally loosened its grip and temperatures began to rise, something catastrophic happened. The great ice sheets, already fractured by cosmic fire, shaken by rapid climate swings, began to collapse. Not slowly, not over millennia, over centuries. Meltwater poured into the oceans faster than the planet had seen in tens of thousands of years. And the seas, which had been rising slowly since the end of the Ice Age, suddenly surged. Geologists call this event meltwater. Pulse 1b. But to the people living along the coasts, those who had built their lives on river deltas, infertile valleys, along what they believed were permanent shorelines, it was simply the flood. The flood that drowned the world. The evidence is carved into coral. Off the coast of Tahiti, deep beneath the turquoise waters of the South Pacific, scientists drilled cores from Ancient coral reefs. Corals are careful record keepers. They grow upward towards sunlight layer by layer, year by year, building colonies that track the sea surface level with geological precision. When sea levels rise slowly, corals keep up. They grow upward at a steady rate, staying just below the waterline. But the Tahiti cores tell a different story. Around 11,600 years ago, the coral growth patterns show something extraordinary: a sudden, desperate vertical climb. The reefs were struggling to keep up with sea levels rising too fast. Analysis shows that global sea levels surged between 7 and 13 meters in less than 500 years, possibly much faster. To put that in perspective, 7 meters is about the height of a two-story building. Imagine the ocean rising that much within a few human lifetimes. Coastlines that had existed for thousands of years would simply vanish. River valleys would become bays. Islands would become submerged reefs. Entire landscapes would be rewritten. This was not a slow, predictable change that ancient peoples could adjust to. This was a catastrophic drowning. And here is the eerie detail: 11,600 years ago is exactly the date Plato gives for the destruction of Atlantis. In his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, he writes that Atlantis sank in a single day and night of misfortune 9,000 years before the time of Solon, which places the event at about 9,600 BC, exactly the moment meltwater pulse 1b struck. Coincidence, or memory hidden inside myth? The best documented victim of this deluge is Doggerland. Today, the North Sea is a cold, grey stretch separating Britain from mainland Europe. Fishing trawlers pull up nets filled with cod and haddock. Oil rigs pierce the seabed. Ferries move cargo between ports. It is industrial, practical, forgettable. But 12,000 years ago, there was no North Sea. There was Doggerland, a vast lolling plain, stretching from what is now eastern England across to Denmark, the Netherlands, and Germany. It was not barren tundra. It was a thriving ecosystem. Rivers cut through deciduous forests. Wetlands teemed with waterfowl. Herds of red deer, orches, and wild boar roamed grasslands that stretched to the horizon, and humans lived there. Archaeological evidence pulled from the seabed: harpoons, flint, tools, workbone proofs that Doggerland was not just a migration path, but a homeland. Communities of hunter-gatherers built camps along its rivers, fished its estuaries, and followed game across its interior. Some researchers believe Doggerland may have supported one of the densest human populations in prehistoric Europe, a crossroads culture that connected the peoples of Britain, Scandinavia, and the continent. Then the ice began to melt. At first, the changes would have been small rivers rising, marshes spreading, seasonal floods that didn't fall back the way they once had. But as meltwater pulse 1b sped up, the pace became terrifying. Year by year, the sea moved in. Valleys flooded and became inlets. Hills became islands. Forests drowned their trees, standing like skeletons in rising salt water before falling into the oncoming waves. People would have retreated again and again, moving inland, abandoning settlements, watching the horizon swallow their hunting grounds. But there was no true inland in Doggerland. The whole region was lollying, and the water kept coming. By 6,500 BC, Doggerland had been reduced to a single island, Doggerbank, a highland that survived as a refuge for perhaps a few more centuries. Then it too slipped beneath the waves. An entire world, its people, its cultures, its stories, drowned, and Britain became an island. Doggerland was not alone. Across the planet, coastlines lived on for millennia were swallowed by rising seas. In the Persian Gulf, geological surveys showed that what is now a shallow sea was once an oasis. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower, the Gulf was a fertile river valley fed by the Tigris, Euphrates, and other rivers that have since been submerged. Pollen records and sediment cores showed that this valley supported lush vegetation, date palms, grasslands, freshwater lakes. It was quite possibly a paradise by Ice Age standards, warm, sheltered, full of water and game. And humans almost certainly lived there. Then meltwater pulse 1b arrived, and the ocean poured in. Within centuries, the whole valley flooded, turning rivers into a shallow sea. If there were settlements, villages, seasonal camps, burial grounds, they now lie beneath 40 meters of water and silt, erased from history. Some researchers suggest this drowning may be the origin of Mesopotamian flood myths. The people who survived, they retreated to the highlands of Sumer, carried memories of a time when the whole world, their world, was underwater. Generations later, those memories became the Epic of Gilgamesh, the tale of Utnapishtim, and eventually the story of Noah. In Southeast Asia, an even larger landmass vanished: Sundaland. The Sunda Shelf is the shallow continental shelf connecting the Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, Java, and Borneo. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were 120 meters lower than today, this was not a chain of islands. It was a subcontinent roughly the size of India. It had rivers, mountains, tropical rainforests, coastlines stretching for thousands of kilometers, and it was inhabited. genetic and archaeological evidence suggests that Sundaland may have been one of the most important regions for early human migration and development in Southeast Asia. It was a gateway between mainland Asia and the Pacific Islands, a biodiversity hotspot, a crucible of human adaptation to tropical environments. Then, as the Ice Age ended and sea levels rose, Sundaland began to drown. Not all at once, the process took thousands of years, but meltwater pulse 1b delivered the killing blow. The final surge submerged the remaining lands, breaking the subcontinent into the archipelago we see today. If there were advanced coastal cultures in Sundaland, fisherfolk, navigators, early maritime societies, their settlements are now 50 to 100 meters underwater, likely destroyed beyond archaeological recovery. The ocean does not just hide history, it erases it. Then there is the Black Sea. Geologists Walter Pittman and William Ryan proposed in the 1990s that the Black Sea was once a freshwater lake cut off from the Mediterranean, sitting about 150 meters below current sea levels, around 5,600 BC. Thousands of years after the main Younger Dryas floods, rising Mediterranean waters finally broke the natural dam at the Bosporus Strait. The result was catastrophic. Salt water poured into the Black Sea basin with the force of 200 Niagara Falls, raising the lake level by 6 in per day. Coastal settlements, Neolithic farming villages around the lake's rim were flooded. People fled inland with whatever they could carry. Underwater archaeology has since supported the idea. Submerged shorelines, ancient riverbeds, and even preserved wooden structures have been found far below the modern sea surface. This event, though later than meltwater pulse 1b, may be a regional echo of the same process: ice melting, seas rising, coastlines drowning. And it happened in a region where human civilization was already taking root, meaning survivors had the ability to preserve the memory. Some scholars suggest this Black Sea deluge is the true origin of the Noah's story, carried by displaced peoples into Mesopotamia and later written into the Bible. But the Black Sea flood was one event in one region. Meltwater pulse 1b was global, and the myths show that across every inhabited continent separated by oceans and thousands of miles, cultures tell stories of a great flood that destroyed the world. The Sumerian king list speaks of kingship descending from heaven, flourishing, and then being swept away by the flood. The Hebrews recount Noah and the ark. The Greeks tell of Deucalion. They survived a deluge sent by Zeus. In India, Manu is warned by a fish Vishnu in disguise to build a boat before the waters rise. The Hopi of North America describe the third world ending in flood. The Mapuche of Chile recount Kai Vilu, the serpent who raised the seas. In Australia, Aboriginal peoples across the continent tell of a time when the seas rose and swallowed coastal lands. Skeptics say these are natural responses to local floods, rivers overflowing, tsunamis, storm surges, but the consistency is striking. The stories do not just describe water. They describe total flooding, a remaking of the world, a before and after split by drowning. And they cluster around the same time period, 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, exactly when meltwater pulse 1b struck. These are not myths. They are memories broken, mythologized, passed down until they hardened into legend. But at their core, they remember the same event: the world flooded, the coastlines drowned, and humanity had to begin again. The flood was real. The evidence is undeniable. Coral cores, submerged forests, drowned landscapes, and myths that span the globe all point to the same conclusion. Around 11,600 years ago, the seas rose with terrifying speed, erasing coastlines, swallowing homelands, and drowning whole chapters of human history beneath the waves. But who lived in those drowned lands? What did they know? What did they build? To answer that, we must turn to the one structure that survived, the monument raised by those who witnessed the catastrophe and swore never to forget. In the aftermath of the flood, as the seas settled into their new boundaries and the drowned lands disappeared beneath the waves, something extraordinary happened. On a barren hilltop in southeastern Turkey, overlooking what is now the Mesopotamian plain, survivors began to build. They did not build houses. They did not build granaries or fortifications. They built something humanity was supposedly never supposed to have imagined, yet: a temple. And they built it from stone that weighed up to 16 tons. This is Göbekli Tepe, and it should not exist. The site was discovered in 1963, but its importance was not understood until the 1990s, when German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavating. What he found challenged every assumption about how civilization began. Göbekli Tepe is made of massive stone circles about 20 meters across, built from shaped limestone pillars arranged in rings. The pillars are carved with detailed reliefs. Foxes, lions, bulls, snakes, scorpions, vultures, and other creatures shown in surprising detail. Some pillars have human-like arms and hands, as if the stones themselves are person-like figures standing in eternal council. The building required knowledge of quarrying, transport, carving, and engineering. It Required organization coordinating labor, planning, architecture, keeping a workforce going. It required a level of social complexity that, according to textbooks, did not yet exist because Göbekli Tepe was built 11,600 years ago. Exactly when the Younger Dryas ended. Exactly when meltwater pulse 1b struck. Exactly when the flood myths say the world was drowned and remade. The people who built it were supposed to be simple hunter-gatherers. Nomadic bands scraping out survival in a post-ice age wilderness. And yet here, they were carving pillars taller than a house, moving stones that modern machines would struggle with, creating astronomical alignments and symbolic art that points to deep knowledge of the cosmos. Göbekli Tepe is not just old, it is impossibly old. It comes before pottery, agriculture, writing, metallurgy, all the things we connect with civilization. It predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It predates the Egyptian pyramids by 7,000 years. And it was built right after the catastrophe. The question that haunts every researcher standing among those stone circles is simple: why? Why would hunter-gatherers, people with no permanent settlements, no extra food stores, no writing, spend generations building a monument this massive? The answer may be in what the stones are trying to say. One pillar, in particular, has drawn intense attention. Archaeologists call it Pillar 43, but it is better known as the vulture stone. Carved into it is a scene that at first looks symbolic: animals, arranged in abstract patterns, geometric shapes, a headless human figure. But in 2017, researchers from the University of Edinburgh suggested a shocking interpretation. They studied the carvings as astronomical symbols. The animals, they argued, are not random. They stand for constellations. And the pattern on the vulture stone matches a specific moment in time, a comet appearing in the constellation Sagittarius, exactly where cosmic debris would have entered Earth's atmosphere during the Younger Dryas impact event. If they are right, Pillar 43 is not mythology. It is a record, a memorial, a warning carved in stone that says this happened. The sky burned. The world changed. Do not forget. The headless human figure on the pillar may stand for death, the wiping out of people, the end of the old world. The vultures around it could symbolize scavengers feeding on ruins, or perhaps the celestial vulture constellation itself, marking the point in the sky where destruction came from. Above the scene, a circular symbol. Looks like the sun. But some researchers suggest it may represent a cosmic impact, an object entering the atmosphere, breaking apart, exploding. Whether this reading is literal or symbolic, one thing is clear: the people who built Göbekli Tepe watched the sky. Multiple pillars show astronomical alignments. The site's direction may match the summer solstice, and the animals carved into the stones, lions, foxes, boars, and rocks, are shown with a precision that suggests deep familiarity. But here is a twist: many of those animals no longer lived in the region when Göbekli Tepe was built. The carvings show species that had vanished during the Younger Dryas extinction or moved to faraway climates. The builders were showing creatures from memory, animals their ancestors knew. Perhaps animals that had roamed the land before the fires came and the floods rose. This is not decoration. This is cultural memory carved into stone. But if Göbekli Tepe is a memorial, what is it remembering? One idea is that it was meant as a warning, a message to future generations that disaster can strike without warning, that the world can be undone by fire and flood, that the heavens are not always kind. The remote hilltop location, visible for miles, suggests it was meant to be seen, visited, remembered. Another idea is that it worked as an astronomical observatory, where survivors tracked the sky to predict or prevent another cosmic disaster. Ancient peoples often built monuments aligned to solstices, equinoxes, and star risings, not out of silly superstition, but out of survival. If your world had been destroyed by something from the sky, you would watch the sky with great care. A third idea is simpler, and maybe the deepest: Göbekli Tepe was a gathering place for the traumatized. Imagine survivors of the Younger Dryas cataclysm, scattered bands who had lost their megafauna, their coastlines, their family. They had watched fire rain from the sky, seen forests burn, watched the sea swallow whole homelands. They had survived, but they were hurt inside. And so they came together not to build a city. They were not ready for that, but to build something shared, something sacred, something that said, we were here, we remember, we survived. Göbekli Tepe may have been humanity's first act of making meaning together after an apocalypse. A way to carry trauma, not through writing. Writing did not exist yet, but through stone and symbol, labor and ritual. And then, around 8000 BC, something even stranger happened. The builders of Göbekli Tepe buried it. Not by accident, not by natural dirt piling up. They deliberately filled the stone circles with rubble and soil, covering the pillars, sealing the site, and walking away. Some enclosures show signs of intentional destruction: pillars broken, carvings damaged before being entombed. Why would people spend generations building a monumental temple only to bury it? Some archaeologists say it was ritual closure, a way of finishing the site's purpose, sealing its power. Others suggest the culture that built Göbekli Tepe was replaced by a new one. Perhaps early farmers who saw the old ways as dangerous and chose to erase them. But there is another possibility. The message had been delivered. If Göbekli Tepe was built to preserve the memory of the Younger Dryas catastrophe, then after thousands of years, the descendants of survivors may have decided the warning was safely locked in. The knowledge had been passed on. The stories had hardened into ritual. The stones had done their job. And so they buried them, not to destroy them, but to protect them hidden under the earth, waiting to be found by a future civilization that might need the same warning waiting for us. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not primitive. They were survivors. They carried the trauma of the Younger Dryas, the fire, the extinctions, the drowning of coastlines. They had lost the world their ancestors knew. And in response, they created something that would outlast them, something that would carry memory forward even if their culture did not survive. Göbekli Tepe stands as proof that civilization did not begin with farming, or writing, or cities. It began with memory. And if the builders were descendants of flood survivors, then the question becomes unavoidable: who were their ancestors? What cultures existed before the Younger Dryas? What knowledge was lost when the coastlines drowned? To answer that, we must turn to the hardest evidence of all, the people who vanished so completely that only their DNA remains inside the genomes of those who survived. The ghost populations, the drowned peoples, the cultures erased from history but not from existence. DNA remembers what history forgets. In the decades since scientists first sequenced the human genome, a new kind of archaeology has appeared, one that reads bones not for artifacts, but for genetic code. Ancient DNA taken from teeth and femurs buried for thousands of years can show migration patterns, population mixing, and evolutionary adaptations with a precision no pottery shard or stone tool can match. But it has also revealed something unsettling: absences. Lineages that appear in the genetic record last for thousands of years and then vanish without descendants. Populations that once thrived across continents, adding to the human gene pool, only to disappear so completely that their names, languages, and cultures are lost forever. Geneticists call them ghost populations, and many of them vanished around 12,000 years ago, exactly when the Younger Dryas ended and the floodwaters rose. The first clues came from studies of modern human genomes. When researchers look at the DNA of living people, they do not just see genes passed down from known ancestral groups, they see strange patterns, genetic signatures that do not quite match, fragments of DNA that point to mixing with populations that no longer exist in any clear form. In Eurasia, ancient genomes from Mesolithic hunter-gatherers show contributions from groups that left no direct descendants. These ghost family lines show up in the DNA of Ice Age people, add genetic material to later groups, and then stop showing up in the fossil record around the Younger Dryas boundary. In Africa, similar patterns appear. Some ancient family lines that were once spread across sub-Saharan Africa show big drops in genetic diversity around 12,000 years ago, as if their populations suddenly collapsed and never fully recovered. In the Americas, the picture is even more broken up. Genetic studies of ancient Paleo-Indian remains show family lines different from modern Native American populations. They were ancestor groups that added to the gene pool, but whose direct descendants are either extinct or blended into mixed populations so completely that they can no longer be traced as distinct peoples. These were not slow extinctions caused by gradual environmental change. The genetic bottlenecks, moments when population sizes crash and diversity drops, are sudden and synchronized. Something happened to these populations. Something sudden, something global. The most likely explanation is the simplest. They lived on the coasts. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were 120 meters lower than today, the world's coastlines looked nothing like they do now. What are now submerged continental shelves were fertile plains, river valleys, estuaries full of fish, and beaches where shellfish could be gathered year-round. And those are exactly the kinds of places humans prefer. Coastal regions offer reliable food sources: fish, shellfish, seabirds, and marine mammals that take less energy to get than hunting inland. They provide natural highways for migration and trade, letting cultures spread along shorelines without needing to cross mountains or deserts. They support denser populations than most inland ecosystems. Archaeological evidence from surviving coastal sites shows that sea-based cultures appeared early in human history. Shell middens. Huge piles of thrown-away shells prove that humans were using coastal resources tens of thousands of years ago. Some researchers argue that humanity's expansion out of Africa followed coastlines, is landing along the submerged routes. But here's the problem. Those coastlines are gone. When meltwater pulse 1b raised sea level 7 to 13 meters in just a few centuries, it didn't just flood low-lying plains. It erased entire ecosystems. Every river mouth, every estuary, every coastal settlement built below the new waterline was drowned. And because coastlines are where sediments build up fastest, those sites weren't just submerged. They were buried under meters of mud and sand, making archaeological recovery nearly impossible. If advanced coastal cultures existed during the Ice Age, people who specialized in fishing, navigation, boat building, and maybe even early forms of sea trade, we would never find them. Their settlements are underwater. Their technologies, wooden boats, fishing nets, shell tools, rotted away over millennia. Their art, if it existed, is gone. The only trace of their existence is the faint genetic echo they left in the survivors who fled inland when the waters rose. The genetic data tells a grim story. In Southeast Asia, studies of ancient genomes show that modern populations carry DNA from ghost groups that no longer exist as distinct peoples. These groups likely lived in Sundaland, the huge subcontinent that connected the Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, Java, and Borneo during the Ice Age. Sundaland was one of the most biodiverse regions on the planet, a tropical region with rainforests, rivers, and coastlines stretching thousands of kilometers. Humans lived there for tens of thousands of years, adapting to sea environments, possibly developing seafaring technologies that let them reach Australia and the Pacific Islands. Then Sundaland drowned, and the people who lived there, their languages, their knowledge, their ways of life were scattered. Some fled to highland refuges, blending with other groups. Some may have died, but their DNA survives in fragments embedded in the genomes of modern Indonesians, Malaysians, and indigenous Pacific Islanders. In Europe, Doggerland's drowning erased what may have been one of the continent's most populated regions. Genetic studies suggest that the hunter-gatherers of Mesolithic Europe carried lineages from peoples who no longer exist in pure form. Were they the inhabitants of Doggerland, the fishers and foragers who thrived on a landmass that is now the North Sea? We will never know their names, but their genes remain. And then there is the Persian Gulf. Geneticists studying Middle Eastern populations have found evidence of a founder effect, a genetic signature showing that modern populations came from a small group of ancestors who survived a population bottleneck. The timing of this bottleneck matches, in an unsettling way, the drowning of the Persian Gulf oasis. Some researchers have suggested a controversial idea. What if the Garden of Eden described in Genesis is a cultural memory of this lost oasis? A fertile valley watered by 4 rivers, the Tigris, Euphrates, and 2 submerged waterways destroyed when the sea rose, forcing its people to flee into the highlands of Mesopotamia. If so, the story of being cast out of paradise might not be about sin and punishment. It might be about climate refugees, people driven from their ancestral homeland by rising seas carrying only memories of a world that no longer existed. But DNA doesn't only record who disappeared. It records trauma. Epigenetics, the study of how experiences can change how genes work, has shown that severe trauma can leave molecular marks that last across generations. Famine, violence, and long-term stress can change how genes are activated. And those changes can be passed to children and grandchildren, even if they never lived through the original trauma themselves. If entire populations witnessed the Younger Dryas cataclysm, saw fire rain from the sky, watched their homelands burn and drown, fled as refugees into unfamiliar territory, that trauma would have been encoded. Not just in stories, but in biology. And when those survivors had children, the biological echoes of catastrophe would have been passed down, mixing with cultural memory, the myths, the warnings, the rituals meant to make sure it never happened again. This is why flood myths are universal. They are not separate inventions. They are not responses to local river floods. They are the inherited memory of a species-wide trauma, carried both genetically and culturally, encoded in ceremony and story, passed from parent to child across hundreds of generations. The myths themselves contain clues. Many flood stories describe survivors as the remnant, a small group who lived through the destruction and became the ancestors of everyone who came after. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim and his family are the only survivors, told to repopulate the world. In the Hebrew Bible, Noah and his descendants repopulate the earth. In Hindu mythology, Manu is saved and becomes the ancestor of humanity. These stories are not literal family trees, but they may point to a deeper truth that modern human populations came from a relatively small number of survivors who lived through the Younger Dryas bottleneck. Those who lived inland, in highlands, away from the drowning coasts. They are our ancestors. The coastal peoples, the maritime cultures, the ghost populations either died out or were absorbed so completely into survivor groups that their distinct identities vanished. But they are not truly gone. They live on in fragments, genetic echoes in our DNA, shadows in our myths, memories encoded in stone and ritual. The flood did not only erase landscapes. It erased peoples. Entire populations whose names we will never know. Cultures whose achievements are lost beneath the waves. Languages that will never be spoken again. Knowledge of navigation, astronomy, ecology, maybe even early forms of writing or symbolic thought that drowned with the coastlines. What the survivors carried forward was not a complete inheritance. It was a remnant, a piece of what humanity once knew, stitched together from fragments, passed down through stories that became more myth-like with each retelling. And perhaps that is why Göbekli Tepe was built not only as a temple, but as an anchor, a way for traumatized peoples to root themselves in stone, to declare their survival, to carve their memory into something that could not be washed away. Because the flood took almost everything, but it could not take the will to remember. And in the memories that survive distorted, mythologized, encoded in DNA and ritual there are clues. Clues that point towards something even more unsettling. The possibility that the drowned lands held not only hunter-gatherer camps, but something greater, something that later generations saw as a lost civilization, a drowned world, a place remembered only as myth. A place called Atlantis. For more than 2,000 years, Atlantis has been dismissed as fantasy, a philosophical story invented by Plato to make a moral point about pride and divine justice. Scholars have searched for it in the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, even the Americas, always deciding it never existed. But what if everyone has been asking the wrong question? The question is not where was Atlantis. The question is what was Atlantis remembering? Because when you strip away the extras, the concentric canals, the mighty empire, the advanced technology, what remains in Plato's story is something shockingly simple. A story about a land that sank beneath the sea in a single catastrophic event, and Plato gave it a date. In his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 BC, Plato tells a story set to the Athenian statesman Solon during his travels in Egypt. Egyptian priests in the city of Sais shared with him an ancient tale kept in their temple records of a great island civilization called Atlantis, that had existed 9,000 years before Solon's time. Solon lived around 600 BC. At 9,000 years, and you reach about 9,600 BC or 11,600 years ago. The exact moment the Younger Dryas ended. The exact moment meltwater pulse 1b struck. The exact moment sea levels surged 7 to 13 meters and drowned coastlines across the globe. This is not approximate. This is exact. Plato says Atlantis was destroyed in a single day and night of misfortune by earthquakes and floods, after which the island sank into the sea and vanished. He places it beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar in the Atlantic Ocean. In a region that was above water during the Ice Age, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, the Azores Plateau, and other submerged features were islands or larger landmasses, when sea levels were 120 meters lower. Dogoland, Sundaland, the Persian Gulf oasis all were habitable lands that sank when the seas rose. Was Plato's story a memory, passed through Egyptian temple records, of real drowning events that happened during meltwater pulse 1b? If so, Atlantis may not be a single place. It may be a combined memory of many drowned worlds, a mythologized blend of coastlines, islands, and land civilizations erased by the flood. And there is evidence that something lies beneath the waves. In 1968, off the coast of Bimini in the Bahamas, divers found what looked like a submerged rotor wall. Huge rectangular stones arranged in straight lines. Called the Bimini Road, the structure sparked decades of argument. Geologists said it was natural beach rock. Others said the stones showed signs of tool marks and careful placement. Off the coast of Cuba, sonar surveys in 2001 found symmetrical stone structures at a depth of 600 meters far, deeper than any known human construction. The shapes seem to include pyramids, roads, and buildings, though later investigations have been unclear. If they are man-made, they would have been built when sea levels were much lower before the end of the Ice Age. Near the Azores, underwater formations have been photographed that some researchers say look angular, possibly artificial. The Azores sit on top of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge and were likely much larger islands, or part of a connected landmass, during the Ice Age. Off the coast of Spain near the Strait of Gibraltar, submerged megalithic structures have been found that seem to be older than known civilizations in the region. Are these natural formations mistaken for ruins? Or are they the remains of coastal settlements built when sea levels were lower, now drowned and covered beyond recognition? The ocean does not preserve evidence well. Wooden structures rot. Stone roads. Silt buries things, and at depths of 50 to 120 meters where Ice Age coastlines, once where systematic archaeological surveys are expensive, dangerous, and rare. But the odd findings remain. Then there is the Piri Reis map. In 1513, Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis made a world map that has confused historians for centuries. The map shows the coastlines of South America and West Africa with amazing accuracy, impressive for the early 16th century. But it also shows something that seems impossible. It appears to show the northern coastline of Antarctica without ice. Antarctica has been covered by ice for millions of years. No human civilization in recorded history has seen its coastline ice-free. And yet the Piri Reis map seems to show it accurately, including mountains and bays that match the under-ice topography revealed only by modern ground-penetrating radar. Piri Reis wrote in notes on the map that he made it using older source maps, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great or earlier. If that is true, it suggests pre-flood cartographic knowledge maps made when sea levels were lower, coastlines were different, and maybe even Antarctica's northern edges were less icebound than today. Skeptics say the map shows a distorted South America, not Antarctica. But the debate raises an uncomfortable question. If ancient peoples had advanced navigation and map-making knowledge, and that knowledge was lost when coastal civilizations drowned, what else was lost with them? Atlantis is not unique. Around the world, separated by oceans and cultures, there are stories of drowned homelands, lands that once existed, were lived in, and then sank beneath rising seas. In India, Tamil traditions speak of Kumari Kandam, a lost continent that once stretched south from the tip of India into the Indian Ocean. Ancient Tamil literature describes it as a vast landmass, where the earliest Tamil civilizations thrived before the sea rose and swallowed it. Geological surveys confirm that the continental shelf south of India was above water during the Ice Age, and would have been flooded during post-glacial sea level rise. In the Pacific, legends of Lemuria or Mu describe a drowned civilization that once connected islands across Oceania. While no geological evidence supports a literal lost continent in the Pacific, the stories may keep memories of larger islands and coastal lands that were submerged as sea levels rose. Aboriginal Australians have oral traditions that speak with eerie detail about lands that once existed where there is now only ocean. Elders from coastal regions describe places their ancestors lived, valleys, freshwater springs, hunting grounds that are now underwater. Some of these stories have been supported by marine archaeology, which has found submerged stone tools and evidence of living on what was once dry land. In Polynesia, origin myths describe ancestral homelands called Hawaiki or Haviki places the first peoples sailed from before the lands were lost to the sea. Some researchers suggest these myths preserve memories of Southeast Asian coastlines, perhaps Sunderland before it sank. The Welsh speak of Cantor Gwalad, a legendary sunken kingdom in what is now Cardigan Bay. The Bretons tell of Is, a city drowned by the sea. The Irish remember Tir na Nog, an otherworldly land beyond the Western Ocean, sometimes seen as a memory of lands now submerged on the continental shelf. Even in the Americas, indigenous groups keep flood traditions. The Tlingit of the Pacific Northwest tell of villages swallowed by the sea. The Chumash of California speak of islands where their ancestors lived before the waters rose. These are not coincidences. They are echoes. What if Atlantis was never one place? What if Plato's story, passed down through Egyptian records, was itself a compilation? A blending of flood memories from many cultures filtered through generations condensed into one mythic story about a great civilization that sank in a day and a night. The Egyptians were trade hubs. They heard stories from Mesopotamians, Phoenicians, Libyans, and Aegean seafarers. Those peoples, in turn, carried their own flood traditions, memories of drowned coastlines, displaced ancestors, and homelands lost to rising seas. Over millennia, those memories blended, became myth, and took on symbolic meaning. Atlantis became a parable. But parables are made from real pieces. The truth may be this: there were many Atlantises. Doggerland was in Atlantis. Sunderland was in Atlantis. The Persian Gulf oasis was in Atlantis. Every fertile coastal plain, every river delta, every lollying homeland drowned by meltwater pulse 1b, was its own lost world. And the survivors carried the memory forward not as perfect history, but as myth. Because myth is what remains when the facts are drowned. When the witnesses are gone, and all that's left is the story told by firelight to children, who tell it to their children, who pass it onward for centuries until it becomes legend. We will never find Atlantis, not the way treasure hunters imagine a single ruined city with columns and golden statues waiting to be dug up. Because Atlantis is everywhere the ocean rose. It is in the drowned forests of Doggerland, the submerged valleys of Sunderland, the flooded oasis beneath the Persian Gulf. It is in the ghost populations whose DNA still lingers in our genes. It is in the aboriginal stories of hunting grounds now 50 meters underwater. It is in the exact date Plato recorded 11,600 years ago when the Younger Dryas ended and the flood came. Atlantis is not a place. It is a moment. The moment when the world drowned and humanity had to begin again with only fragments of what came before. But if entire coastlines were erased, if cultures vanished, if knowledge was lost, what remains? The answer is in the stones. In the monuments raised by survivors who promised never to forget. In the megaliths aligned to sky events. In the temples buried on purpose. In the cairns and circles spread across landscapes from Turkey to Britain to Peru. These structures are older than we thought. They encode knowledge we do not fully understand. And they may be the last physical evidence of what the flood tried to erase. If the flood erased so much, how did the memories survive? The answer is right in front of us, scattered across every inhabited continent. Stones massive, puzzling, aligned with sky-level precision, monuments that whisper of knowledge far older than the civilizations that are said to have built them. Megaliths that required engineering, organization, and astronomy knowledge that, according to standard timelines, should not have existed yet. These stones are not just tombs or temples. They are archives, stores of knowledge encoded in alignment, angle, and orientation. And many of them point to the sky, tracking the sun, moon, and stars with an intensity that feels almost desperate, like the builders were watching for something, waiting for it to come back. Stonehenge is the most famous, but it is not alone. Rising from the Salisbury Plain in southern England, the huge sarsen stones and bluestones of Stonehenge have fascinated people for millennia. Archaeologists date its building to around 3000 BC, placing it in the Neolithic period. But the site itself, the location, may be much older. Under and around Stonehenge are older structures, timber posts, earthworks, cremation pits dating back to 8000 BC. The site was sacred long before the stones were raised, suggesting it marks something important, perhaps an earlier monument that rotted away long ago, or an alignment noticed by pre-Neolithic peoples. And the alignments are clear. Stonehenge's main axis aligns exactly with the summer solstice sunrise and the winter solstice sunset. On the longest day of the year, the sun rises directly over the heel stone, filling the center of the monument with light. This is not an accident. This is deliberate astronomical engineering. But why? Why would Neolithic farmers spend generations dragging 25-ton stones from quarries 240 kilometers away just to mark the solstice? One answer: because the knowledge was inherited, because their ancestors, survivors of the Younger Dryas, watched the sky obsessively, and that watchfulness became ritual, then religion, then architecture. Stonehenge is not unique. In Armenia, the site of Karahange, also called Sour's Kare, has over 200 standing stones, many with round holes carved through them. These holes line up with certain stars and sky events, creating a prehistoric observatory dating back to at least 5500 BC, possibly earlier. In the Egyptian Sahara, the stone circle of Nabta Playa is 2,000 years older than Stonehenge. Built around 5000 BC by cattle herders in what was then a seasonal lake bed, the stones align with the summer solstice, and certain star systems, including Sirius, the dog star whose heliacal rising signaled the yearly Nile flood. But here is the mystery. By the time Nabta Playa was built, the Sahara was already drying. The lake was shrinking. The people who built it would soon leave the region. Why build an astronomical monument in a place you know you will have to leave unless the knowledge wasn't originally theirs? Unless they were protecting something older, a tradition passed down from ancestors who learned, maybe the hard way, that sky events matter, that the sky is not always safe, and that it must be watched. In Ireland, the passage tomb of Newgrange offers another clue. Built around 3200 BC, Newgrange is older than the Egyptian pyramids. Its entrance is aligned so exactly with the winter solstice sunrise that once a year and only once sunlight travels down the narrow passage and lights up the inner chamber for exactly 17 minutes. The engineering needed is incredible. The builders had to calculate solar angles, build a roof box opening at the exact height and angle, and orient the whole 80 meters passage to within a tiny fraction of a degree. This level of astronomy knowledge suggests generations of observation, maybe centuries of tracking the sun's movement. But Newgrange also has carvings, spirals, concentric circles, lozenges. Some researchers think these symbols record sky knowledge, maps of lunar cycles, solar paths, or even comet paths. The spirals, especially, appear at megalithic sites from Ireland to Malta to New Mexico, always tied to astronomical or cosmic meaning. Were these symbols a kind of language, a way to record and pass on knowledge, without writing, a way to preserve the memory of catastrophe and the sky events that caused it? Then there are the stones that seem like they should not exist at all. In Baalbek, Lebanon, the ancient Roman temple of Jupiter sits on a foundation of stones so huge they are hard to explain. The trilithon, 3 limestone blocks forming part of the base each, weighs about 800 tons. Nearby, still in the quarry, lies the stone of the pregnant woman, estimated to weigh 1,000 tons. These are not Roman stones. The Romans built on top of them, but they did not move them. No crane in the ancient world could lift 800 tons. Modern cranes struggle with that weight. The challenge of cutting, moving, and placing these megaliths, even with rollers, ramps, and thousands of workers, pushes the limits of Bronze Age, or even Roman, engineering. Yet there they are. Local legends say the stones were placed by Cain, the son of Adam, or by giants before the flood. Mainstream archaeology credits them to the Phoenicians or earlier Canaanite peoples, but gives no convincing explanation for how they were moved. The same mystery follows megalithic sites worldwide. Atlanta Tambo in Peru, huge andesite blocks some weighing 50 tons fit together so tightly that a knife blade cannot slip between them. At Pumapunku in Bolivia, blocks of diorite show signs of advanced stone cutting that seems wrong for the copper and stone tools available to pre-Columbian cultures. At Göbekli Tepe, pillars weighing 16 tons were quarried, moved, carved, and raised by hunter-gatherers. The pattern is worldwide. The technology is hard to explain. And the standard timeline that civilization began with agriculture 10,000 years ago struggles to explain it. Unless something came before. Unless the flood did not erase everything. Unless some knowledge, some skills, some survivors carry pieces of an older tradition into the post-flood world. And then there is the Piri Reis map, which will not go away. Drawn in 1513 by Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis, the map shows the Atlantic Ocean, the coasts of South America and Africa, and controversially a landmass that some think is Antarctica without ice. Piri Reis wrote in the margins that his map came from more than 20 source maps, some from the time of Alexander the Great, 4th century BC, or earlier. If true, this suggests sophisticated maritime cartography in the ancient world, far beyond what historians usually accept. The debated part shows the coastline south of South America with mountains and bays. Skeptics say it is just a distorted picture of South America's southern coast. But others point out that when the Peary Rice map is compared with modern under-ice maps of Antarctica, made using radar, the features match, in an unsettling way, the Greenland land coastline, as it would look without ice. Antarctica has been ice-covered for at least 6,000 years, likely much longer. No known civilization mapped it ice-free. Yet it looks like someone, at some point, had cartographic knowledge of coastlines that came before the flood, coastlines that were submerged or ice-covered before the rise of any recorded civilization. If the Peary Rice map really reflects ancient source material, it suggests pre-flood maritime knowledge navigators who sailed, mapped, and recorded coastlines during the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower, and Antarctica's northern edges may have been less glaciated. But maybe the deepest purpose of these monuments is the simplest. They are watching the sky. The Beckley Teeps vulture stone may show a comet. Stonehenge tracks solstices with obsessive precision. Nabta aligns with Sirius. Newgrange captures the winter sunrise. Carahenge's stones point to specific stars. These are not decorations. These are early warning systems. If your ancestors survived a cosmic impact, if they saw fire rain from the sky, watched the world burn, and lived through the flood that followed, you would teach your children to watch the heavens. You would track sky patterns, looking for warnings, trying to predict the next catastrophe. And you would carve that knowledge into the most permanent material you have: stone, because wood rots, papyrus burns, and memory fades. But stone, aligned to the heavens, too massive to be moved except by the most determined destroyers, endures. These monuments are not temples to forgotten gods. They are observatories, calendars, and warnings, a proof of a species that survived destruction and promised never to be caught unready again. The stones remember what we have forgotten. They remember a time when the sky could betray us, when climate could flip in decades, when seas could rise and swallow whole worlds. And they stand now, silent guards, still aligned to sky events we no longer watch for, still encoding knowledge we have dismissed as superstition. But the question remains, did it work? Did the survivors' vigilance save us from another catastrophe? Or have we just been lucky, living in a quiet pause between Earth's great resets? To answer that, we must bring all the evidence together. The black mats, the extinctions, the floods, the DNA, the myths, the monuments. We must ask the question that has haunted this whole journey. What if the Younger Dryas was not a one-time accident, but a cycle? And what if the real flood, the event behind all the stories, was exactly what the evidence says it was? All the pieces are here now, scattered across time and space, waiting to be put together. The black mats rich with cosmic signatures. The vanished megafauna. The drowned coastlines. The ghost populations erased from history. The monuments aligned to sky warnings. The myths that echo across every culture, and the date, always the date pointing to the same moment, 11,600 years ago. When you set them side by side, when you let the evidence speak without forcing it into old stories, a pattern appears. Not a theory. Not speculation. A convergence. The Younger Dryas was not only a climate event. It was the event, the catastrophe every flood myth is remembering. The disaster that reset civilization. The moment when fire and water teamed up to remake the world. This was the Great Flood. Start with the fire. The black mats tell us that 12,900 years ago, something entered Earth's atmosphere. Whether it was a broken-up comet or a dense meteor stream, the result was catastrophic. Airbursts across the northern hemisphere. Wildfires burning forests across whole continents. Sudden ash darkening the skies. The evidence is physical: iridium, platinum, nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, meltwater. These are not signs of myth. They are fingerprints of cosmic impact. And the myths back it up. From the Hopi to the Norse, from Mesopotamia to Aboriginal Australia, the stories begin with fire from the sky. Not symbolic fire, literal descriptions of burning heavens, falling stars, and worlds swallowed by flame before the waters came. Geology and mythology match. The fire came first. Then came the collapse. Within centuries, 35 genera of North American megafauna vanished. Mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant sloths, dire wolves, creatures that had survived multiple ice ages disappear, in what is basically an instant in evolution. The extinction was not gradual. It was synchronized, happening at the Younger Dryas boundary across multiple continents. The wildfires destroyed habitats. The sudden climate reversal, warming abruptly replaced by this and-year freeze, shattered ecosystems. Herbivores starved, predators followed, and the human cultures that depended on them collapsed. The Clovis people vanished from the archaeological record. Natufian settlements in the Levant weakened. Across Togoland, communities that had thrived for millennia faced the double disaster of returning ice and rising seas. This was not just environmental stress. This was ecological apocalypse. And then came the flood. As the Younger Dryas finally released its grip around 11,600 years ago, temperatures rose quickly. The ice sheets, already destabilized by cosmic fire and thousands of years of climate chaos, began to collapse. Meltwater Pulse 1b was the result: a surge of glacial meltwater pouring into the ocean so fast that sea levels rose 7 to 13 meters in less than 500 years, possibly much faster. Coral reefs struggled to keep up. Coastlines that had been lived on for thousands of years were drowned. Doggerland vanished beneath the North Sea. Sunderland broke apart into the Indonesian archipelago. The Persian Gulf oasis was swallowed. River valleys became bays. Islands became reefs. This was not a river spilling its banks. This was a planetary deluge. The kind described in myths as the whole world flooding. Because for people living on those coasts, their entire world did flood. And the survivors remembered. The Göbekli Tepe rises in the Turkish highlands within centuries of the Younger Dryas ending. As if the trauma demanded an immediate monument, hunter-gatherers who are said to have lacked the organization or technology somehow built huge stone circles carved with animals that no longer live there, and symbols that may show the cosmic event that caused the catastrophe. It is not a city. It is not a palace. It is a memorial. A way for traumatized people to anchor their survival in stone. To carve their memory of fire and flood into something that could not be washed away or burned. Then they buried it on purpose, sealing the warning for future generations. The DNA supports what archaeology hints at. Those populations' lineages that appear in ancient genomes and then disappear around the Younger Dryas boundaries show that entire peoples were erased. Those who lived on the coasts, who relied on sea resources, who may have developed early navigation and trade, they drowned with the coastlines or were absorbed into survivor populations so completely that their identities were lost. But pieces remain genetic echoes in modern populations, statistical oddities that hint at ancestors whose names we will never know. The flood didn't only erase landscapes. It erased peoples, and their only memorial is the faint signature they left in the genomes of those who survived. And the myths from every corner of the world remember the same event. Mesopotamian, Hebrew, Greek, Hindu, Chinese, Aztec, Norse, Polynesian, Aboriginal cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years all tell of a great flood that destroyed the world. Not local floods. Not river overflows. The global catastrophe that reshaped the earth and forced humanity to begin again. Skeptics have long called these separate inventions natural responses to local disasters, but the consistency is too strong to ignore. The timing gathers around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. The structure is the same. Fire comes before water. The world is remade. Survivors carry memory forward. These are not just moral stories. They are inherited trauma, cultural memory of a real event reshaped over generations, but rooted in planetary disaster. And then there is Plato's date 9,000 years before Solon, about 11,600 years ago. The exact moment meltwater pulse 1b hit and the Younger Dryas ended. Atlantis may not be one place, but that does not matter. What matters is that Plato, using Egyptian temple records, preserved a date, and that date matches the geological, archaeological, and mythological evidence for the greatest flood in human history. Atlantis is not fantasy. It is memory distorted, mythologized, but basically accurate. The memory of when seas rose, coastlines drowned, and entire worlds slipped beneath the waves. The conclusion is unavoidable. The Younger Dryas was the Great Flood. Not the flood of Noah, which may be a later local echo. Not the flood of Gilgamesh, written thousands of years after the event. The original flood, the catastrophe so huge, so global, so traumatic that it stamped itself onto every human culture, and has echoed through our stories ever since. It is the only event in human history big enough to explain the myths. The only disaster synchronized across continents. The only catastrophe that combined fire, extinction, and planet-scale drowning in one terrifying chain of events. This is what the evidence says. This is what the myths remember. This is what the stones, the DNA, and the drowned landscapes all point to. The Great Flood was real, and it happened 12,000 years ago. But here is the unsettling part. Earth does this regularly. The Younger Dryas is not unique in Earth's history. It is part of a pattern, a cycle of catastrophic resets driven by cosmic events, climate swings, and ice sheet collapse. Ice core records showed that abrupt climate shifts happened again and again during the Ice Age. Asteroid and comet impacts dot the geological record. Mass extinctions break up the timeline of life on Earth. We like to think of history as a straight line, steady progress from primitive to advanced, from ignorance to knowledge. But Earth's history is cyclical periods of calm interrupted by catastrophe. Civilizations rising, then erased. Knowledge built up, then lost. We may be living in the calm interval. The Holocene, the 11,600 years since the Younger Dryas ended, has been unusually stable by geological standards. No major cosmic impacts. No sudden climate flips. No new continent-running floods. But stability is not forever, and the sky is not empty. The monuments still watch. The myths still warn. The stones still point to the heavens, tracking sky rhythms we have stopped paying attention to. Maybe that is the real message carved into Göbekli Tepe, into Stonehenge, into the megaliths around the world. Not that catastrophe happened once, but that it can happen again. The flood survivors knew this. They watched the sky obsessively. They built observatories. They carved warnings into stone and ritual. They told their children, remember, watch, do not forget. And over millennia, we forgot anyway. But the evidence remains in the black mats under our feet, in the bones of vanished giants, in the drowned forests of Doggerland and the submerged valleys of Sunderland, in the DNA we carry from ghost populations we will never meet. In the myths we tell half thinking they are fantasy. In the stones that still stand aligned to sky events still waiting, still watching. The Great Flood was not a myth. It was real. Humanity survived. We rebuilt. We forgot. But the earth remembers. And now, as the fire in the hearth grows dim and the night gets deeper, as the stories settle into memory and the mind drifts towards sleep, think about this. Somewhere beneath the North Sea, forests still stand drowned and silent. Somewhere beneath the Persian Gulf, rivers still flow buried in sediment. Somewhere in our DNA, the ghost populations still remain fragments of peoples whose names were swallowed by the flood. The world we know is built on the ruins of worlds we have forgotten. And the stones ancient, massive, aligned to the stars stand as guards, reminding us that the sky is not always gentle, that the seas do not always stay put, and that the earth itself can turn against us. But we survived once, and if we remember, if we listen to the myths, read the stones, honor the memory encoded in bone and DNA, maybe we can survive again. The flood came, the flood passed, and we remain asleep now beneath skies that hold both wonder and warning. And remember, you are the descendant of survivors, the inheritor of memory, the keeper of stories that refuse to die. The Great Flood was real, and we are still.